But we will go on with our next speaker, with Professor Marc Chesney. He is a head of Department of Banking and Finance and the Center of Competence in Sustainable Finance of the University of Zürich in Switzerland. After having been Associate Dean of HEC Paris, author of The Permanent Crisis, The Financial Oligarchy and the Failure of Democracy, for many years he has been developing a critical analysis of the financial sector and its consequences to the real economy and on the hostage-taking of democracies. Mr. Chesney, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Michelle. This evening I will focus on indecent work. Indecent, what does it mean here? Indecent, despite it guarantees a very high income, and despite it includes a very good social protections. Indecent because it is linked to cynicism and bets. So we are going to focus on the other side of the coin, because there is no child labor and slavery without cynicism. And so I will try to understand the context, the financial context, and what happened during the 13-year lifespan between, let's say, the bankruptcy of the bank Lehman Brothers and the scandals associated to Credit Suisse, the recent scandals. So I'm going to focus on the financial sector, and more precisely on around 30 big banks, too big to fail institutions, out of 30,000 banks. So I'm focusing on these too big to fail institutions. That is a program for this evening. So again, I will start with Lehman Brothers, and I will explain the current context, give examples of toxic finance products, of bets and cynicism, and conclude on a positive note. So I will rely on my book, so chapters 2 and 4 precisely. So what happened 13 years ago with Lehman Brothers bankruptcy? It's interesting. I read the last annual report, which is still online. Very interesting. So if you have the time to have a look, you will find words such as record performance, terrific results, talent management efforts, excellence, focus on risk management. Incredible. A few months after they disappeared, they went bankrupt, but they used to focus on excellence and risk management. And this bank was supposed to, according to its yearly report, was supposed to address questions about climate change and also focus on sustainability, responsibility, philanthropy. So basically greenwashing. Regarding the rating agencies, this bank received good ratings still a few days before its bankruptcy, at least A. And the last CEO of this bank received between 2000 and 2007 around $500 million, despite his responsibility for the bankruptcy. Okay, so it was a failure of financial analysts, basically. So I took the time to read this yearly report. It's like a puzzle. You have to try to understand how it works, and one ratio would have been enough to understand that the situation was very dangerous. And this ratio is 50, which appears here, 50. It's the relationship between off-balance sheet activities and balance sheet activities. So basically, balance sheet activities, basically it's like an iceberg, so what you see, and off-balance sheet activities, what you hide below the table with many complex and dubious deals. So what about today now? So in a nutshell, because we don't have a lot of time, in green you have a global GDP until 2019, around 88 $26,000 billion. In orange, you have debt, global debt, private and public debt together. Before COVID-19, it corresponded to around 300% of global GDP. Now it's at around 360% of global GDP. So that's too high. Just to be clear, it's too high. We have to be realistic. It will not be possible for companies, for all the companies and countries, to reimburse this huge level of debt. So we will be confronted, and we are already confronted, to defaults or bankruptcies. And in this kind of finance casino, there are bets. So you know, in my introduction, I spoke about cynicism. So at the same time, during which in hospitals, doctors used to fight against COVID-19, to sacrifice themselves, even physically. At the same time, you have hedge funds which are betting on the bankruptcy of companies and countries. That is cynicism, just to be clear. And what are these products? So in red here, you have so-called derivative products. As soon as you start studying finance, you will learn in textbooks that these products are useful for companies in order to hedge against financial risk, and it's true. But only a small percentage is used as hedging products, because you don't need hedging products corresponding to around 9 times global GDP. You will need hedging products corresponding maybe to 20, 30, 40% of global GDP, but not 9 times. So the remaining percentage, maybe 99%, corresponds to bets, again, on defaults and bankruptcy. So here another slide. I kept the same global GDP, the same values here, global GDPs, debt and derivative products, and I changed the scale. And here we have the scale of the financial transactions, simply huge, around 150 times the GDP. So it's so huge. I mean, everything, all the transactions, all the electronic transactions, is so huge that if this level, this volume of electronic transactions would be considered as a tax basis, a microtax of around 0.1% would be enough to get rid of the VAT, for example, and to help many families in Switzerland and in many countries. Okay, let me move forward with financial products, just to give you an idea in a nutshell. According to the SIX, so the exchange in Switzerland, we have here weekly data related to derivatives. Second week of October 2020. I know it's late and I'm not going to go into detail. But what you see here around equity, I hope you see my mouse, equity here. So derivatives on equity, so on stock prices, basically. The volume corresponds to, here, what you see here, between 18 and 19 billion of Swiss francs, only for Switzerland. So in other words, if you compare that to the GDP, to the Swiss GDP, it corresponds to 26,000 times the Swiss GDP. I repeat, 26,000 times the Swiss GDP. Why is it so huge? And again, the answer is simple, because a huge amount here corresponds to bets and cynicism. Move forward. What about today? So we know the situation here. I have some data about the two big banks in Switzerland, but the situation is similar abroad, in the US, in Germany, in England, in France. Off-balance sheet activities, derivatives are huge. So they corresponded in 2019 for Credit Suisse to 26 times the size of the balance sheet, around 30 times the Swiss GDP for one bank. These bets correspond to 30 times the size of the country, and around 25% of global GDP. Similar for UBS, same kind of situations. So these bets represent 25% of world GDP and 30 times the size of Swiss GDP. It's interesting because if you are a taxpayer in Switzerland, you might be interesting to be aware of the risk of so-called too big to fail institutions. Now, what is new today? is a shadow banking sector. It existed 13 years ago, but now it's much stronger. So what does it mean? It means financial institutions without banking license. So for example, BlackRock is not a bank, but it's very strong, much stronger than 13 years ago. Now, talking about Credit Suisse, you know what happened a few weeks ago. Huge bets of Credit Suisse with two hedge funds, basically Archegos and Greensill. The bets corresponded to around 50% of the capital of the bank, 50%. And so 20 billion Swiss francs and 5 billion were lost. And it's not finished. So now, just to be concrete in the last minutes of my presentation, I would like to give an example of these bets which are off balance sheet. A CDS, a credit default swap. I presume most of you don't know what it is, so allow me to start from scratch and to explain what it is. If you Google, you will find this definition. A CDS is a derivative product that allows its owner to protect himself against the risk of default of a reference entity. So just to give you an example here, on this graph, you see a bank gives a loan to a company, an amount X, for example, 10 million Swiss francs. Between the company and an insurance company, you have always insurance contracts. And if this company here on the right-hand side is, let's say, a restaurant, a company linked to restaurants or hotels, tourism, let's assume it might be the case that the bank gave the loan, for example, here before COVID-19, and during COVID-19, the bank fears that the company might go bankrupt. So the bank will buy a CDS, a credit default swap, to the insurance company. So for example, if the company gives back only, let's say, 3 million instead of 10 million, the bank will activate its CDS. The CDS corresponds, in my example, to 10 million Swiss francs, and the bank will receive the difference, 7 million Swiss francs. So far, so good. A CDS is useful. It's an insurance contract. Now, if you read if you dig deeper in Google, you will find this comment. It is not necessary to actually be exposed to the reference entity's risk in order to enter into a CDS contract. So I tried to explain and to translate. It means that it is not necessary for a company to be exposed to risk in order to hedge. So what does it mean? If I don't own a car, why should I be allowed to buy a car insurance? So in this example, despite the fact I don't have a car, I would be allowed to buy a car insurance. Not on my car because I have no car, but maybe on the car of the neighbor because I know he drives poorly. He might have an accident. So given that nothing is regulated for CDS, for cars, obviously it's forbidden. Otherwise, we'd have many accidents. But here in this case, CDS, it's allowed. So if it would be allowed for cars, then I would have incentives maybe to identify the neighbor who drives very poorly, and to invite him before he drives to give him a glass of alcohol to make sure he will have an accident. And I will not buy only one so-called car insurance, but 10, 20, 100. It's not regulated. So here, again, for cars, it's forbidden, and it's good. For CDSs in the financial sector, it's still allowed today, 2021. So you have huge bets, again, on the bankruptcy of companies. And it creates a systemic risk. So at the end of the day, you know, in my example, the bank will buy, instead of buying one CDS on the company for 10 million Swiss francs, will buy maybe 10 CDSs on, so 10 times 10, 100 billion Swiss francs. Why? The bank is exposed only to a maximum risk of 10 billion Swiss francs, not 1 million. At the end of the day, the bank will make a huge profit if the company goes bankrupt. Finally, one of these companies might go bankrupt, and given that they are too big to fail, the taxpayer will pay the bill. By the way, it's not liberalism, it's something different, because the first principle of liberalism is very simple. If you engage in risky activities, you assume risks. And here is not the case, given that the taxpayer assumes risks. The social impacts are huge. So here you have the income distribution. What do we see? Nothing, basically, because we have an horizontal line here for 99.99% of the population. And on the vertical axis here, you have the remaining 0.01%. And here I wrote regarding the income, not in million, but in billion dollars or Swiss francs. So Jeff Bezos, for example, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, on July 20th, received 13 billion, not million, 13 billion Swiss francs in one day. The first time in the history that one person was allowed to be richer of 13 billion dollars. It corresponds in one day to twice what 1.3 billion Africans received on the same day. It corresponds also to 10 times the value of the Castle of Versailles. 10 times, not in 50 years, as it was the case with the Castle of Versailles, in one day. So we have to be aware of that, of the other side of the coin. And we are confronted with a disconnection between the financial sector in red here and the real economy in green. So here you have stock prices for the biggest companies in the US in red, and the earnings of the same companies. And what you see here, simply a disconnection, which is due to what? To the monetary policy of central banks. They inject huge amount of money in the financial sector, hoping that the financial sector will give loans to the real economy. It's not really the case. And instead of observing really an inflation in the real economy, it might come, but today still quiet. We observe an inflation in the financial sector, meaning that stock prices keep increasing. Okay, now let's talk again about decent work, and let me give you very precise examples of some traders. Mr. Jérôme Kerviel, who used to work for Société Générale in Paris, he went to jail because he was accused of a loss of 4.9 billion euros in 2007. And the police took his emails. Let me give you an example of what he wrote. In a trading room, the ideal modus operandi can be summed up in one phrase: knowing how to take the maximum risk to gain the bank the maximum money. In the name of such a rule, the most elementary principles of caution don't count for much. In the midst of the great banking orgy, traders have the same consideration as any average prostitute: the quick acknowledgement that today's paycheck was good. Example number 2, Mr. Touré, who used to work for Goldman Sachs, and the process was organized in New York against Goldmans Sachs, who sold dubious product to its clients. The police took his emails again. I quote, "There is more and more leverage in the system, so more and more debt. The whole building might collapse at any time. When I think there was a little of me in the creation of this product, he means here derivatives, bets, the kind of thing you invent saying to yourself, what about creating a machine that serves no purpose at all, that is totally conceptual and highly theoretical, and that nobody knows how to price? It is bad for the head to watch it implode in full flight." It is a little like Frankenstein turning against his inventor. Third example, Mr. Polk, a former trader who wrote various articles in the New York Times, and I quote, "Not only was I not helping to fix any problems in the world, but I was profiting from them. Cynism. In my last year on Wall Street, my bonus was $3.6 million. And I was angry because it wasn't big enough. I was 30 years old, had no children to raise, no debts to pay, no philanthropic goal in mind. I wanted more money for exactly the same reason an alcoholic needs another drink. I was addicted." So in a nutshell, three examples. The first one compares himself to a prostitute, the second one to Frankenstein, and the third one says he's addicted. Let me show you a last example, a former director of Goldman Sachs, who left this bank, and he explained why. "Today is my last day at Goldman Sachs. After almost 12 years at the firm, I believe I've worked here long enough to understand the trajectory of its culture, its people, and its identity. And I can honestly say that the environment now is as toxic and destructive as I have ever seen it. To put the problem in the simplest terms, the interests of the client continue to be sidelined in the way the firm operates and thinks about making money. Cynism." Conclusion. So it's not only the bankruptcy of a bank, namely Lehman Brothers. It's a bankruptcy of a system of casino finance in which debts, bets, and cynicism prevail over saving, investment, and trust. This process plunges society into a permanent crisis. Too big to fail institutions, so big banks, around 30 big banks and hedge funds, by the way, enjoy all sorts of advantages and guarantees, so state guarantees, basically, that contrast starkly with the liberal principles they proclaim. And last but not least, obviously there are solutions, because I want everybody to be able to sleep this evening. And I want to conclude on a positive note. I mean, there are many solutions. For example, in order to make sure there is no toxic financial products, a certification process would be useful. It is the case in most of the branches of the sectors: car industry, pharma industry. Why not in the financial industry? And etc. etc. Microtax, we spoke about that. Microtax on electronic payments, point 6. The volume of electronic transactions is so huge that the microtax would be enough to get rid of various taxes. Economic and finance courses should be adapted. I mean, we should draw lessons of what happened in 2000. Professors, of what happened in 2008 and after. If you compare the program of courses, still basically in 2006, 7, 8, and now, you will see differences, but not enough. So it's a responsibility of professors to make sure we draw lessons. Finally, separation of retail and investment banks. The President Roosevelt introduced in 1933 the so-called Glass-Steagall Act, so to separate again investment banks from retail banks, and it worked because we had much less banking crisis in particular after World War II until 1999. This act was repealed by President Clinton, unfortunately. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to read the last comment of the chat box, because it's exactly what I think. Mr. Sommer says, "Thanks for a most interesting and shocking presentation." So there is a lot of new content, and it's quite shocking. Yeah. So there is a comment. There's a comment. Thank you very much to Professor Chesney for this very interesting contribution. There's a lot to do, and I wonder if, at least in Switzerland, FINMA will be up to its responsibility.
Sorry, FINMA. I hope, but it's not really the case today, because the FINMA should check the quality of these financial products, but still allows the diffusion of these products today. So there are financial products, there are toxic financial products today that clients can't buy, and they lose a lot of money. So FINMA should be much more active here and should check whether or not these products, what these products mean, if they are useful for the economy, for the society. If yes, they should be allowed. If not, they should not. And you know, I mean, same thing for medicines. If we are confronted with toxic medicines, obviously it should be forbidden, and that should be the same thing with financial products. But it's not the case, unfortunately.
Thank you. There's another question to Professor Chesney. With the potential revenue on microtaxes on transactions, what is your read? Why it is not implemented? Because the discussion on it is not new.
Sorry, precisely, it is new. It is new. There is not this huge amount of transaction didn't exist 1 century ago, even not 50 years ago. It is new. It corresponds to 150 times the GDP. So I think something new. Let's say it started 30, 40 years ago, something like that, with the so-called financialization of the economy, meaning that the financial sector is in a position to take the power. And that is something new again. It was not the case 200 years ago. So to impose its logic to the economy and to the society. So it's new because, again, this volume is huge. And because it's not the so-called Tobin tax, people might have heard about that. Because here with Tobin, the idea was to focus on specific transactions, on stock transactions or currency transactions. Here, the idea of the microtax is to consider all electronic transactions without exception. So between banks, with clients, if you go to a restaurant, hairdresser, whatever, ATM, whatever, everything with the same rate, 0.1%, something like that, very small, microtax. So that's simple. I mean, technically very simple. Politically very delicate issue, because obviously if most of the bank could agree, I say could agree because we wrote in the document that banks would be paid for such a work. So if they collect money, tax money, they should keep a given percentage, so they will be paid. So for small banks it could make sense. For big banks it would be different because they rely on the so-called high frequency trading, meaning that they buy and sell stocks at milli or microseconds, just to be clear. So obviously they will pay more tax. They would pay more tax with a microtax than us, but most of the people and most of the company would pay less. So it would be an advantage for, let's say, 99% of the population and of the companies, but the remaining 1%, here we're talking about too big to fail institutions, is obviously against this kind of idea. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it is time to wrap up. I would like, there are two questions, and I think they are the questions of the world, and maybe everybody of you could say one sentence to answer it, because with this you will answer all the problems. So the first question is, what needs to happen and where are the roadblocks? One sentence. Whoever wants to start.
Money should be perceived as not as an end in itself, but as means to be happy, but not as an end in itself. Otherwise, it's a sickness.